Increasingly, newcomers enter the life of a congregation through venues other than worship, such as service activities, fellowship, or community events. In this presentation, you'll learn how your congregation can attract and engage more new people by recognizing and expanding other points of entry. And you'll learn about ways to invite, welcome, and connect visitors whose first point of contact comes through an activity other than worship. In the 14th chapter of John, Jesus is recorded as saying, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you I'm going there to prepare a place for you?" Just as our Father's house has many rooms, so too our churches typically have many rooms. There are classrooms and spaces dedicated to mission, rooms for children, and rooms for a myriad of different activities. But typically, the only room we invite newcomers into is the sanctuary. We tend to think of worship as the only point of entry, and we wait until people filter through worship to invite them into other aspects of congregational life. But increasingly, newcomers are entering the life of congregations through the side door rather than just the front door, attracted initially not by worship, but by programmatic ministries, service activities, fellowship, or community events. So I'd like to begin with this question: how do people enter the life of a congregation? In most congregations today, worship is the primary entry point. In about 90% of churches in the United States, most new people who connect with the church will first make that contact through the worship service. But it wasn't always that way. For a long time, Sunday school was the most likely church entry point for adults as well as children and youth. Well into the 1950s, in many denominations and regions, the most common invitation church members gave to their friends or neighbors was to attend a Sunday school class with them. And it wasn't uncommon for church school attendance to run higher than worship attendance. Yet in the past several decades, we've come to assume that this pattern is normative. People will first come to worship, then join, then get involved in activities such as small groups or Sunday school or missions. For this reason, in most churches, invitation and welcome are centered around Sunday worship. Because if you assume that people will come to you through worship, how are you going to reach new people? You advertise your worship services. And how do you welcome them? You put on the friendly in and around worship. And how do you follow up with them? You register and track your worship visitors. But what if the reason that fewer new people are coming to church is because there are fewer and fewer people seeking out a worship experience? This paradigm of worship as the primary entry point worked well over the past several decades when church attendance was far more normative, when it was assumed that you would attend church and the only question was where. But what if? What if there are fewer people who understand their need to worship God before they come into the life of the church? If there are fewer people shopping for worship, then centering all your outreach around worship may no longer be adequate. Not surprisingly then, there's growing evidence to suggest that we are again at a point of shifting entry points. For example, more and more people today, particularly young people, are seeking to connect with the life of the church through service or mission. In my church, for example, we have a large number of university students who come to us to volunteer in our homeless shelters and in our food recovery ministry. They don't necessarily attend worship. The reason that they come to our church is because of our social service engagement. Yet in most cases, all of our evangelistic energy is directed toward those who visit worship. This slide illustrates the most common paradigm when worship is the primary entry point. Newcomers first enter the church by attending worship, and then, from that starting point, they're connected with other ministries and activities. This next slide illustrates if a church has multiple entry points. It shows how people can enter the church through the side door rather than the front door. They first become connected with events, programs, or activities, and from there, they become connected with the church and worship. In this slide, the flow is essentially reversed. But in reality, it will be both and. In a multiple entry point church, people will be coming in through the side door and the front door. Why focus on entry points other than worship? One simple reason is that the more entry points you have, the more porous your church becomes to newcomers. One of the paradigm shifts underway in the way people come into the lives of churches today is that belonging now often comes before believing. We used to live in a culture where people believed before coming to a church. The movement today is sometimes described as belonging before believing. Persons are seeking first a place where they can find a community of belonging that can help them connect with God and others in significant ways. They may not know a great deal about faith, but over time they come to share the beliefs of those with whom they belong, even if that wasn't their initial reason for seeking out a church. Another reason to focus on entry points other than worship is that research has demonstrated that growing churches have more entry points than non-growing churches. One reason for this is that entry points other than worship can have greater appeal to the disaffected or disinterested. For example, community service events can be an entry point for those who are skeptical, uninformed, or even have negative experience with organized religion, and they can potentially help them rethink what it means to be a follower of Jesus in today's world. But another important reason to focus on entry points other than worship is that many church members are uncomfortable inviting their friends to worship, but they're more willing to invite them to other types of events. These reasons for focusing on entry points other than worship are summarized in this quote by Gary McIntosh. He says, "Growing churches usually have at least 3 non-threatening entry points to their church. The reason? New people find it uncomfortable to attend church. And I would add that church people find it uncomfortable inviting people to attend worship. Hence the importance of non-worship entry points." So with that as introduction, I want to continue through this presentation focusing on 3 objectives. The first is how to expand points of entry. The second is how to encourage people to visit your church through points of entry other than worship. And the third is how to respond effectively to non-worship visitors. And the key questions are these: what existing ministries could be developed into entry points? What new ministries might be developed as entry points? And what's necessary to make multiple points of entry successful in attracting newcomers and connecting them to your church? Let's think for a moment about the type of programmatic ministries that might function as entry points. Children's ministry, for example. Do you have a daycare or a preschool in your church that attracts people from beyond your church community? What about a vacation Bible school or other kinds of children's programming? What about support groups or recovering ministries? These can be important magnets for people to find their way into your church community. Sports or recreation ministries. Various types of community events, such as concerts or lectures, art shows, picnics, things that are going on out in the community that people are interested in being part of. Ministries of community service or mission can be particularly attractive, as we've already discussed. And then also off-site activities, things that are held not on your church property but in other places, can be effective entry points, again because they're non-threatening. People don't necessarily feel like they're going to church, and so it's a way that they can begin to build relationships that lead them toward your church. What makes a ministry an effective entry point? The first and most critical question to consider in assessing whether an existing or new ministry might be an entry point is, does it appeal to a need or interest in the community? Is it something that might attract someone who may not necessarily be church shopping, but may be looking for some other type of help or engagement? You cannot assess this based on your own perceptions of what people might want or need. You need to make an informed assessment. One simple thing you can do is ask church members to make a list of their unchurched friends and then have them list things that their friends are interested in, such as sports or classes or crafts. You can talk to community leaders. You can talk to school leaders. But the most important thing is to gather informed input, not just to guess what people want or need based on your own thoughts or opinions. It's also important that a ministry be open and accessible to newcomers for it to function as an entry point. In the case of an existing ministry, it's not enough to know that there are many singles in your community and that you have a singles ministry. Because for that ministry to function as an entry point, your singles ministry has to be accessible and open to the presence of newcomers. If your existing groups are closed in on themselves or full of people who may not make the best first impression on a newcomer, then it's probably better to think about launching some new programs as entry points. Another critical factor in allowing a ministry to function effectively as an entry point is the mindset of the leaders. You know, most of the leaders of program activities think that their primary role is to do whatever it is that their group does. They think they're there to teach a class or facilitate a group or to get a certain project done. And they may not see it as part of their responsibility to be the ambassador of the church in welcoming and connecting new people. This can require a change in mindset or even a change in leadership, or the assignment of additional leaders within every ministry to attend to these functions. But for a ministry to be effective as an entry point, your leaders have to openly embrace that possibility and function in a way that helps newcomers get involved. And that leads us to the importance of relationships. One of the reasons that ministries other than worship can be so effective as entry points is that relationships naturally develop in these activities. So a ministry is a good entry point if it is a place where someone will get to know church members and be known by them and begin to feel comfortable because of the relationships that they develop in that ministry. How would someone from outside your church learn about a ministry that might be an entry point for them? Often, the only thing that churches advertise to external audiences is their worship. Communication about other ministries is mainly directed at internal audiences, which reinforces worship as the primary point of entry. And it hides from people outside the church the variety of activities that your church offers. Those outside the church may think that the church is only about worship. And this is why it's so important, if you want to develop multiple points of entry, to think about inviting. How is it that you advertise your non-worship events? There's no one way of doing this. It depends on the nature of the ministry and who you're trying to reach, but you need a plan. It's also important to realize that when we are talking about non-worship points of entry, personal invitations are very important, because church members are more willing to invite friends to non-worship events that might be of interest, things like parenting classes or support groups or a community day of service. And guests are less skeptical in accepting the invitation. So personal invitations are a very important way that we can attract people to activities other than worship in our churches. When someone makes first contact with your faith community through a non-worship event, you're not just welcoming that newcomer to the event or activity, you're welcoming them to the church. And that's why it's so important that you have a system for greeting them, for keeping track of them, for thanking them, and for inviting them back. With each of your ministries that is functioning as an entry point, you need to ask, who is the greeter? And you need to focus on a system that keeps track of your non-worship visitors. You also can ask, do they receive the same kind of welcome as do your worship visitors? If your pastor sends a letter to worship visitors, it might be appropriate to send a similar letter to participants in a community service event or a vacation Bible school. You want to make sure that those people who first visit your church through a point of entry other than worship are adequately welcomed. And then finally, if you have invited someone to a ministry other than worship and you have welcomed them, you need to then think about how you can connect them with the broader life of your church. How is it that someone who enters through a sub-ministry connected with the broader church? How might they be encouraged to get involved with other activities? How can you encourage them to begin attending worship? Providing information is a good first step. And let me again give an example from my church. As I said, we have a lot of local college students who volunteer in our homeless ministry and our food recovery ministry. So we have just set up a special display of information in the shelter's volunteer office and outside our kitchen that welcomes students, and it provides them with information on our campus ministry and our college-age programming. It provides them with information on other volunteer activities and also on worship times. If we didn't make special arrangement to have that information in the place where these students are serving, they would never see it. But because we know the profile of these people entering our community through this entry point, we're able to tailor information especially to them. And let me say this, our initial goal with these students isn't to get them to worship, it's to get them connected with our campus ministry. So our campus minister is working with us on following up with these students. If you have people who connect with your community through an activity such as a vacation Bible school or a mission trip, one way that you can draw people who are involved with programs such as vacation Bible schools or mission teams, one way that you can draw them into the worship life of your congregation is to plan special worship services that relate to the program that they're involved in, and then make a special effort to invite them to attend these special worship services. For example, you might plan a commissioning service or an appreciation service for a volunteer team, or a worship celebration of your vacation Bible school, or you might schedule as part of worship a musical performance by your preschool children. This not only encourages these people to attend worship, but the really great thing is that because these invitations go out to a group of people, when they come to worship, they already know other people there, and so they feel comfortable. Another way of drawing people who connect with your church through an entry point other than worship, another way of drawing them into the life of your church is through people who function as connectors. You know, there are some people who are just naturally good at making connections. When they meet someone, they automatically think about asking them who they know, or asking them what they're interested in, or suggesting that they get involved in things. And so you need to ask, who are the connectors involved in your entry point ministries who can take responsibility for making sure that newcomers get integrated into the life of the church? And if no one is just naturally filling this role, you may need to recruit someone to do it and assign this role to someone to make sure that it gets done on a systematic basis. Susan Beaumont of the Alban Institute says, every ministry of the church needs to have its own method for drawing people more deeply into the life of the congregation. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about using various ministries as a way of connecting people with the life of the church and then drawing them more deeply in. I want to make a special point of commenting on the importance of service as an entry point for young adults. Research by the United Methodist Church indicates that although 37% of young adults age 18 to 29 never attend church, the same group has a strong appetite for engaging causes. 30% of those the church surveyed had donated money to a nonprofit organization, 36% had volunteered time, and 32% had tried to persuade someone else to support a cause. 35% of those polled said that they had either participated in a service trip or planned to do so within the next 3 years. And so inviting young people to serve in the community is an important entry point into church involvement. Issues of interest include social welfare, education, and health needs. Also, global service opportunities can be an important entry point for young adults. I'd like to briefly mention some other types of ministry events. And one is bridge events, because in addition to your standing ministries, special events, or what are called bridge events, can also be points of entry. Bridge events are special events designed specifically to draw people from your community into relationship with your church. So these would be events that you plan explicitly for the purpose of inviting people to connect with an activity as a way of introducing them to your church. So examples might be hosting a fair or a carnival or a community picnic, a school supply giveaway, an Easter egg hunt that you might do in a park. The idea is a very low barrier, non-threatening event that people will want to come to. It's also worth noting that in our internet age, there also can be digital points of entry. People might become connected with your church through your website, through a blog, through social media, through an online worship service, through online sermons. These are all ways that people might first meet your church. And in this day and age, it's probably important to think about how it is that you are inviting, welcoming, and connecting people who connect in that way. Also, I want to note that you create additional entry points when you have ministries located in more than one location. So churches that have multiple worship services in a variety of locations, churches with multi-site ministries and off-site programmings. When you decentralize your ministry in terms of location, you are creating multiple geographic points of entry. And so that also functions as a way of increasing the ways into your church. So let's conclude by thinking about how you might get started in beginning to invite, welcome, and connect more new people through ministries other than worship. If you have an existing ministry that already attracts newcomers, then the best thing to do is to start by improving your invitation, your welcome, and your connecting related to that ministry. But if you currently have no entry points beyond worship, then a way to get started is to be strategic in planning and launching one new ministry for this purpose. I hope this has been helpful to you in thinking about how your church can be more open to new people through a variety of different kinds of ministries. And in closing, let me offer this prayer. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for being a God who never stops reaching out to us, who continually searches for the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. We thank you for being a God whose house has many rooms and prepares a place for all. As we seek to welcome more people into your household of faith, help us be creative and open to new possibilities. We pray that all ministries undertaken in your name might be places of welcome and avenues of faith development. Amen.